Okay, 3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History. My name is Jody Avergan. And we are back with our Sunday election chat. A little more conversational, a little less historical. We've got some things to say about this year's race as we are under a month away from the 2024 election, or election day, that is. The election is definitely here. Of course, we're going to bring some historical perspective, but thanks to everyone who has responded and said that they appreciated us doing these episodes, and shout out to everyone in particular who is watching these on YouTube. That's right, you can go to our YouTube channel and check them out. But here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. I always say nice to see you, even on audio, but actually nice to see you here on video. Hello.
Lovely to see your two faces.
I know. Hey there from Dallas.
Yes, I was going to say, you just got off a plane, and Kellie, both of you just flew, right? Did you pass each other in the air?
in the air. Yes. I flew to Texas, so yeah, I'm in Dallas.
We probably crossed midair.
I know, you can see my background is completely different now, but
was
it's
this
kind
week
of a nice
any
hotel.
calmer than last week on the travel and personal workload front?
Much better.
Good.
Much better. No,
but I will tell you, I did take a break to eat an apple cider donut at a orchard in Virginia. And
what's the fall? What's October without an apple cider donut?
Right?
Here in New York, it's like, what's October without it being under like 75? I mean, it's really incredible weather, but
yeah,
you have these moments where you're standing in the sun and you're sweating and you're like, this shouldn't be happening in the middle of October.
Yeah.
just a little.
But yeah.
Apocalypse aside.
Aside. So look, this is what we're going to do. We're going to actually have a conversation in a little bit about this year's media environment, because it is really fascinating. And I feel like this last week, it kind of like burst onto the scene about just a lot of examples of just how different and interesting this year's media environment is. And we have a great guest who's going to help us do that. But just the three of us real quick, any thoughts on like actual developments in the race since last week, other than candidates going on yet more podcasts? What else jumped out to you? I mean, from the polling perspective, from a state of the race perspective, it continues to be just kind of like these two flat lines, and I sort of have some thoughts about the state of that.
It's a nail biter. Like I feel like maybe every day, maybe every few hours, I don't know, there's another poll that comes out that's like, it's neck and neck in Pennsylvania. Trump's taking the lead in Arizona. She's got an edge in Pennsylvania. Like, I just like, it's too much.
But they all kind of amount to nothing, right?
Yeah,
So
I know, because
really
it's still.
thing.
It's still a tie, you know,
Yeah,
like it's still not
well within the margin of error. It's a total coin flip, but you know, and that was the theme of our conversation last week, was stasis. And I guess the definition of stasis is that not much changes. So here we are.
Here we are.
Stasis.
I agree that the polls have not offered us much to chew on, and still stand by my point that we shouldn't chew on them that much to begin with. But I do think there were some interesting things that happened this week, including the return of Barack Obama. Who sort of went a little viral over the last few days, talking to young Black men to say, get it together and vote for Kamala Harris.
And
I
I'm here for that.
It was scolding, right?
Well,
It was,
he
yeah.
has been called the scolder in chief before, especially when it comes to Black men, because this was kind of a thing with his presidency, is that, you know, he does have this habit of like doing a little bit of the pull your pants up thing.
Yes, especially with the Black community, especially. And that does rub me the wrong way. But this particular speech, I don't know, you can't really call it a speech, but like a sort of conversation, whatever. I was here for it. I was here for it because, I mean, I've been having the same conversations in my own circles about kind of like the barbershop, beauty shop conversations about like, well, I can't have a female boss and I don't know about voting for women. And it just grates me so bad. And it just, I kind of want to pull people aside and like shake them. Like, have you not seen how Black women have stand for you, how they have repped for the entire world? Like, and it just feels like, I mean, it does feel like a betrayal when people are like, well, I don't know. And you're like, what's not to know? What's not to know?
But Kellie, is he scolding around a genuine dynamic? So look, some of the polling this year does indicate that there has been a little bit of a shift among Black voters, you know, from like super duper duper overwhelmingly in favor of Democrats to like very overwhelmingly in favor of Democrats, 80 something percent to mid 70%, but like a 10-ish point drift. Which again, in an election this close, every little slice, you can
counts.
point to it. But gosh, I mean, for the former president of the United States to take that little slice and use the kind of big moment he appears in this election cycle to sort of drive at that. I mean, is he diagnosing a real problem? I've heard a lot of people in response been like, what about all the white women who are voting in majority numbers for Trump, or white men, So I don't know. What do you make?
But I feel like there are those intra conversations that you have in community. And I imagine that the room that Obama was in was not a room of white men and women and a diverse crowd. It was predominantly Black men, at least from the camera footage that I could see. I saw him standing around Black men. Those conversations make sense to me when you are inside the group. Now, outside the group, absolutely. I'm always like, white women, come get your friends, come get your sisters, like, tell them what's up. Like, same thing with white men, do the same thing. But, and that's where it gets sticky, I think, when it becomes like part of the public conversation. And there are some conversations that you are really having in-house. And when it goes outside of that, it opens you up for critique. But I don't think he was wrong to sort of address what a lot of people have been saying within Black spaces, which is this doubtfulness about women leaders and sort of the validity of Trump that just feels like, were you not here just like 4 or 5 years ago? Where were you?
I do think that there is, I'm glad you mentioned the sort of intergroup conversation, because it is reminiscent of those conversations being had like a month ago with White Dudes for Harris, that there is this kind of collective organizing and a kind of calling in that's happening among all of these different groups. And when those conversations escape those spaces, as they inevitably do, there's a lot of misunderstanding, misemphasis on things that can be hard to integrate into the broader conversation. I do think it's interesting. I mean, we're not going to know until election day, because there have been times in the past where the polls suggested there was going to be a kind of swing among Black voters and others that doesn't actually materialize on election day. Leah Wright Rigueur is very emphatic about paying attention to how things actually shake out. But I do think that there is something to watch, which is people have been talking about this idea of racial depolarization, which I think is overstated, but is something that is happening. And then gender polarization, right? Where we're seeing potentially the biggest gender gap we've ever seen in a presidential election before happening in this election. And what happens when things get polarized along the lines of gender, and they create these sort of affinities that cross racial lines, because people are being bound together along gender and frankly along misogyny lines. And that's going to be, I think, something very interesting to watch. And it's exactly the tactic of the Trump campaign, is to push that gender polarization as hard as they possibly can. And we'll see if it works in about 3.5 weeks.
We will.
I think it's the real rub is like two groups. Like, it hurts, I think, to hear other Black men talk about Black women like they're not ready for leadership. But it's equally disturbing when I hear women talk about other women like they're not ready for leadership. And I'm like, where's the solidarity, people? Where's the solid? That's to me is what's a real rub. Because you expect it from, people like Trump and in his camp. But when you hear it from your own, it really feels depressing.
Yeah. And, just kind of bringing what I feel like I've learned on this podcast and the sort of history of watching elections, and then the dynamics that we see just in modern politics. Like, this comment brings out kind of all of the big sort of forces that you see, which is just like, in a race this close, the anxiety just gets ratcheted up. Democrats are much more anxious for all sorts of reasons than Republicans tend to be. And, the fine line between calling people in and calling them out and, rallying and recrimination, all that stuff is like floating when an election is this close. And, it's this funny thing where it's like, Jay Kang, who, is a writer I really admire, often sort of very heterodox and sort of makes me think, but he wrote a piece in the New Yorker this week about the kind of coin flip nature of this election and just all politics right now, in the sense that, like, you can kind of tell any story about anything working or not working. And chances are coming out of this, like the pundit class will just be able to kind of point at anything and be like, well, whoever happened to lose, like lost because of this. And everyone will be like, yeah, kind of. And that has sort of seeped to voters too, where there's this sort of sense of like, not helplessness, but just a sort of like, well, it's going to be a coin flip. Let's see what happens. And we're going to go through the motions, and I'm going to like look at social media. I'm going to watch cable news, and I'm going to kind of have opinions. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's just is what it is, which I totally get. I find that too. But I think the flip side of that is also, we've said it over and over, that when something's that close, like you can't say, okay, this one thing is going to win the election, but you also can't say the thing that wouldn't have won like you have to just sort of pull on every lever. You got to try everything, you know? And so I just feel like for those of you listening who give a shit and care about this election, like you still got to just like push, and because who knows, it could be that small random thing that tilts this. And sort of on that front, I mean, I do want to say, like, I just want to plug one thing I did this week, and I was sort of honored to take part in, but I wrote a little essay for a project called 270 Reasons, which is a thing put together by Dave Eggers, the writer who reached out to a bunch of folks. I don't know how a lowly podcaster got asked to do this, but, you know, a bunch of people who I really admire wrote essays about, you know, why they're supporting Harris and Walz. And, you know, I contributed, and, you know, I don't think anyone listening to this show will find it surprising that I find this Donald Trump character a little suspect. So I wrote a little
new information.
I contributed a little essay about sort of dignity and decency that I see in Harris and that I don't see in Trump, and that I feel like you can have every policy conversation and quibble in the world, but the sort of table stakes have to be a sort of level of humanity and decency. But there's essays from Percival Everett and George Saunders and Michael Pollan and Debbie Millman and Dennis Lehane and Ken Burns and, you know, just all sorts of like really Jeff Tweedy. You know, it's great company.
That's
for me
great.
To be in.
I was about to say,
fantastic. I know,
Jody.
right?
How I got, but anyway, it's called 270reasons.com, and like, yeah, you have to like will yourself to just remember like this stuff matters. I can make a difference. Do what you can. And so maybe, you know, that's just something for our listeners to keep in mind.
I love that.
Nihilism helps no one.
Exactly.
Yeah, no.
It might help someone. But let's turn to the kind of big idea that we want to dig into this week, which is the kind of fracturing media environment. And we are joined, as people can see who are watching this, by Nayeema Raza, who is the co-host of the podcast Mixed Signals from Semafor. Her co-host is Ben Smith, longtime journalist and good and just great watcher of the media space. But Nayeema, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jody, Kellie, and Nicole, for having me.
Especially on a weekend. I know this is a weekend.
Oh, I know.
But are there weekends for someone?
I was going to say, what is a weekend, Jody?
I did when I was asked to do this at Saturday at 4 p.m. yesterday. I'm like, do the same rules of dating apply to podcasting? Like, I should pretend I'm busy and like ask me next time with more notice.
I felt a little reluctant asking you, but also as someone who has covered elections, I know that you kind of just like you take your hand and you just sweep all your obligations off the table 3 weeks after an election, and we're in it.
Well, I heard you were writing something with Ken Burns and Dave Eggers, so then I had to show up, Jody.
Well, there you go. All right, so we've kind of mentioned this a little bit on a few episodes that we've done this week because we're kind of in the middle of a bunch of media-y type episodes on our show. But I'm curious, Nayeema, if you can kind of like react to this notion I think all of us have, which is that like the media worlds that these two campaigns are operating in seem more divorced than ever and almost maybe completely unoverlapping and just sort of running on parallel tracks. But like, can you just sort of paint a picture as you see it of the media environment that Harris and Trump are trying to navigate?
Of course. And I see what you're saying. It's a very heterosexual divorce because one is pandering to a male audience, one more to a female audience. But I don't think it's so, I think that's the kind of the headline of it. But I also think that both Harris and Trump are continuing a strategy that we've seen over the years, and particularly start with 2008 with then candidate Obama, just playing into non-traditional media, thinking that, and this is a natural progression. So we remember in 2008 where I think the then candidate Barack Obama was on David Letterman or was, you know, kind of doing Monday Night Football, and you'd see, and then that picked up in 2012. He was I think on Fallon at the time, doing the slow jamming the news. And then in 2014, 2015, nothing to do with the campaign, President Obama was talking to YouTubers like Lozelle Green and Ingrid Nielsen. And I thought those were kind of interesting picks for him and Bill, and the Bill Simmons of it all. So I think there's one way to look at it, which is a splintering of these two campaigns, and we should talk about that. But I also think there's this larger kind of existential question for people in media of what is the role of traditional media? There's been a massive amount of splintering, fragmentation, and in something that requires targeting and precision as much as advertising, as much as political advertising, as much as political campaigns, this seems like a natural end where people can kind of just cross-tab their own media blitzes, right? Oh, we need to target women under the age of 40. Let's go here. We need to talk to men and low propensity voters because we have to change the configuration of this election. Well, let's go to the YouTube, the comedy bros, the crypto bros. And so that's what's happening, I think, at a broad level. I'll stop there for a second.
No, that's fascinating.
It is a fascinating development because when modern campaigning was born, there was, people were still doing sort of like targeted advertising and targeted outreach to particular groups. But particularly like by the 1930s and 40s and 50s, you have television shows and radio shows that genuinely everybody watches, where you are going to get like a third of Americans watching at any one time. And so your media strategy runs directly through sort of the established media outlets because that's where all the people are. And now where all the people are is scattered everywhere. Like you just, and like how do you get them?
Yeah, and there's no common culture. I mean, more people watched Trump's conversation with Theo Vaughn than watch the Harris Waltz interview with Dana Bash on CNN, right? So that tells you something, right? Call Her Daddy has an audience that I think is 50% in the South and Midwest. This is according to one research firm. And, apparently almost 50% Republican or independent. So, that's Alex Cooper, Call Her Daddy. That is a way to reach someone. Too. Yeah, and 40 million listeners. Not that many people.
So on that front, because is there a tension or are these sort of two different stories that like one is this is sliced and diced micro targeting, but also these numbers are huge. Like this is reaching a massive number of people. So is it that this actually is the most efficient way to reach like 10 million people at a pop?
I think that's the question. And 10 million people of the demographic that you want. And I think as a journalist, I'm upset that we're not getting more traditional media interviews with the candidates. I do think that they serve a purpose, and we can talk about what that purpose is. But as somebody who understands strategy, the ways of the world, I also understand what they are doing from a strategy perspective. And if there's one common, in some case, like target of society these days, like people can agree to dislike the media, whatever the media is, right? And so this has been a big part of Trump's, strategy over the course of now, almost the greater balance of 10 years is target the media. The media is dishonest. Why talk to the media? And the Harris campaign hasn't been at that level, but certainly President Biden even, is disenchanted with the media, has been. There has been tension between the Biden campaign, the Biden administration and the New York Times, calling on the media to take a stronger position at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. This is a tension that has existed with both candidates at very different degrees. And I don't want to do a false equivalency here, but that exists. Yeah.
Yeah, what's interesting about the podcast spaces is that you do have these like very large numbers, but they do kind of harken back to going on Fallon or Richard Nixon going on Laugh-In, where you're reaching out to people in spaces where they don't necessarily expect
to see you.
Politics. And so they're not people who are necessarily there because they're politically revved up, right? It's a different audience than you would get on MSNBC or even really the nightly news, where you're expecting at least something current eventsy. And it's not to say that these shows aren't political, but that they don't necessarily always talk about politics in that kind of overt way that you would expect from like a 60 Minutes or a Sunday morning show.
Well, some of them are totally not political, like all the Smoke podcasts, right? So that's one that Kamala Harris went to that isn't a female-led podcast. This is one where she's targeting, I think they have something like 80 to 90% male audience, and a lot of non-white men listen to that podcast. So
two ex-NBA players. It's a basketball podcast. It's a great one, by the way. I listen to it. But,
And Howard Stern had Kamala Harris on, also had Joe Biden on as when he was running his campaign. So it's not where you expect to meet politicians, and yet you get a different flavor of them, and probably one that is more amenable to the campaign themselves, right? You hear Kamala Harris and all the Smoke speaking about being a stepmother and talking about kind of the empathy with which she addressed and tried to build a relationship with her stepchildren without, displacing their mother and trying to honor them. You hear, Kamala Harris talking to Oprah about using a gun to protect herself in her own home. Like, these are not expected interview thoughts. And sure, you're not being, I do think this is where traditional media has a role, though. What you want during a campaign is to understand who the candidate is. And the big question for voters, this is from voters from reporting, is who is Kamala Harris? What does she actually stand for? How different is she or not from the Biden administration? There's been a race to define her both by the Trump camp and by the Harris camp. And I think that traditional journalistic interviews, they push back. They tend to really try to understand, what do you stand for? They try to box you in, right? Yeah. We fact check, we push back. We're trying to build a record of what the candidate believes on certain issues. And that record becomes important for public accountability later on. I don't think you're necessarily going to find that from Call Her Daddy.
Yeah.
No, but people want that. When I say they want that, they want the sort of human element that's like somewhat superficial, a little silly. They want to, who are you as a person? It goes back to the George Bush, can I get a beer with him kind of thing. Like, people want to connect on a human level before they feel like they can invest their vote in you. But
Kellie, you said on the show, I think a couple episodes ago, you said, you kind of referred to, we were touching on this, and you talked about there are people who are not equipped to have the important conversations that you need to have with someone who's running for president. And I guess the question to me is, obviously I agree with you, these kinds of conversations are important as a sort of one part of the meal. But if this is the only place that we're hearing from folks in a sort of long form, in-depth way, does that worry you? And
especially when the questions are like cats or dogs, something like, I don't need to know that from my elected. There are some questions that I think it was refreshing to hear Kamala Harris talk about her role as a stepmother, as a mom. I was interested in that, but I think there are much higher stakes when we start to think about what kinds of decisions are you going to be making when you get into this office? What kind of impact are you going to have on the lives of most Americans? That's going to have nothing to do with how they eat their pizza or, what TV shows they watch or whatever it is. So
are they a good hang?
Right. Yeah. There's a place for laughs and I get the humanity of it, but a lot of it is a distraction. And I think just kind of gets us further away from where we need to be.
Right. I would point out that, though, in this last week media blitz ending on, October 10th or whatever it was, that Kamala Harris did go on Colbert, did go on CBS 60 Minutes. Yeah. And, Donald Trump was also meant to be in a 60-minute special, but withdrew, not wanting to be fact checked. And in fact, has come after CBS for editing certain distribution of its of the 60 Minutes interview in outlets. So, and she was on The View. So there were some more traditional, I don't know that The View is traditional press, but they was trying to do both.
The Overton window has shifted to the point where The View is our journalistic.
I'm like, 60 Minutes, The View.
Exactly. And then Donald Trump, presumably is doing this, Fox News town hall about women's issues and is, appearing in these spaces. And I think, look, it's not that it's not happening. It's is it happening at the volume at which voters need to happen? Or are they tapping into something that's real, which is people are exhausted with the news cycle. They don't feel like there's anything more to learn, particularly maybe in the case of Donald Trump. Voters who are already established don't feel like they knew this guy. He was the president for 4 years. He was a candidate again. He's been in the public eye now for decades. They understand him. That said, there's something about meeting people where they are, and they're kind of the podcasting medium, which we're all in for a reason, right? It's like we all make podcasts because they are successful, people listen to them. And there's a greater intimacy in just someone having a conversation and feeling like you're sitting in listening on that, and getting to know someone. Now, does that help build a record of what the vice president actually believes will be the difference in her Israel-Gaza policy versus the administration's? I don't think we have felt that, even with CBS's like great attempts to kind of understand. I don't think we know the answer to that question still, but maybe voters are thinking, hey, I know enough here. And then the Trump strategy, meanwhile, is, okay, let's get these low propensity voters, and basically operating in beyond the Fox News, Newsmax ecosystem. He's out there talking to what I'd call like a few different types of bros. Like one is, and I don't use the word bro in any, disparaging way, although I know it does sound like that. But there's the kind of video gamer community. That's the Aiden Ross on Kick, right? Who strangely gave him a Rolex during that interview. There's the UFC manosphere, which is a long time relationship between UFC chair Dana White and Donald Trump. So he went on Logan Paul's podcast. There's the kind of comedian set. So he's going on Theo Vaughn, who has 3 million YouTube followers, 7 million TikTok followers. And then there's the tech bro crypto sphere. So the Lex Friedmans, the all-in guys, the Elon with his 200 million Twitter followers. That is not just a huge megaphone, but also a huge arsenal for fundraising, where Donald Trump is behind right now, of course, the race. But there's something, and he's tapping into this through his son, Barron Trump, who's kind of deep in crypto sphere. I think that's been a leading indicator of him, for former President Donald Trump, of where to show up and who to talk to. And the question is, will these people actually vote? Because young men who are in these cases in their own video gaming, sports, crypto community is going to actually turn up is a big question.
I appreciate you painting the sort of wide swath of bro that
thank you.
It's a real panoply.
There's a range.
We are not a monolith.
A richness.
I know.
Over and over.
I've always thought if there was one mission I have in life, it's to correct the idea that bro is a monolith. And so thank you.
Oh man.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of the low propensity voter, but also, going on these shows that aren't typically about politics, there's this question about, when you say meeting people where they are, not just like what they listen to, but what they're interested in. And so you can kind of see this as a sort of leaking of influencer culture into politics, right? And the kinds of conversations that are being had and the kind of pitches and what you're doing while you're having the conversation. Are you making a cake? What are you doing? But then also maybe there is something other than policy that gets people out to vote. Maybe we would love for them to vote on policy, but actually, like when you're trying to bring people along who aren't that tapped into politics, is the sort of like non-political conversation an on-ramp to get them interested in policy, or actually is their interest in the candidate really just, do I like this person? Well,
And in particular, I think at this stage in the campaign, and we talked about this, I think we talked about it last week, but I do have this notion that a lot of what happens in the last few weeks of a campaign is that sort of like more, do I feel comfortable making this decision thing, rather than a sort of cold calculus of policy decisions. It's the coming home that we've talked about, right? I just am finding my way back to pulling the lever for this person. And I think that is a much more sort of like emotional connected decision than a sort of rational policy thing. And so I think it makes sense that at this stage in particular, you're seeing these candidates putting themselves in those spaces. But Nayeema, do you feel like you've noticed the people who are hosting these conversations, do they feel any obligation to say, well, if this is the space that these candidates are coming into, I got to ask some tough questions and I got to kind of fill in the journalistic gaps, or are they just going to do their thing?
Yeah, I feel like you heard that in the Alex Cooper podcast, right? I think you heard that also in The View. They asked a question about Biden and Harris that resulted in a kind of political ad for Donald Trump, where she said that she's much more similar to him than, her answer in the debates, for example. So I think that I do think that there is pressure. And look, like it's not like journalists are batting 100, and so there's always like people on the other side of that interview. And again, I think that both of these candidates are giving interviews to traditional media outlets, just not at the level that we would like them, or at the level of frequency that we would want them. But yeah, I do think there's a pressure. I mean, what do you guys think? You're following, and I'm curious also, like
we've
how much
everyone a million times.
Yeah, and you got me, but and I'm not running, so there's that. But I mean, have you guys felt this? Like, what have you found the quality of the conversations, Kellie? It sounds like you have not been impressed. I don't know, but am I assuming incorrectly?
I listen so much that I hear both Trump and Harris give the same answer over and over and over again, maybe with a little different, more nuance, or, adding more details or something. But even on Call Her Daddy, I still felt like Kamala sticks to a script. She has very much a set script in terms of what she's going to say. So for me, it's not a ton of new information, but if you've not been paying attention, some people haven't, and it's your first time hearing her speak, then it will feel fresh for you. But for me, I think it's gotten stale, especially towards the end, because I know I'm not going to get a new revelatory sort of like policy piece or idea or, I didn't know that. There's not too many of those moments. And so sometimes it can be frustrating.
Well, and I think it's always important to remember too that we are the weirdos, right? Like we are the outliers who have like watched all of these speeches and watched all of these interviews. That in fact, that the voter that they are going after is the one who hasn't heard any of this. And so, if you've heard 100 Harris stump speeches, you're probably in the outer ranges of and not the target audience.
I do think that this season the debates have been revelatory. I feel like the debates I've learned a lot, actually, even as someone who is a weirdo, as you described, a self-admitted weirdo. But yeah, they have been, particularly even in the Vance Waltz debate. I thought that was really, I didn't know what to expect, and it was more kind of American Pie, and also illuminating about the kind of blind spots of either candidate, either vice presidential candidate. And the deference, I just like felt so much deference in that
in that debate.
Very much so. It's very odd. Yeah.
But I think that, one of the things that I find that is a struggle, and I think is a struggle in the coverage of campaigns over the past decade, has been fealty to reality is not strong, even in those debates. And so how do you measure the quality of a debate when you're like you're seeing this deference and you're hearing these surprising answers, but the answers in some cases are surprising because the person isn't telling the truth, and that's revelatory for strategy. Like when JD Vance was talking about abortion and reproductive rights in that debate, we got a clear look at what the strategy was for the Trump campaign. I don't think that necessarily told us JD Vance's views on that. But it gave us a window into the strategy. And I think that's been the tricky thing, is that we've moved so far from the sort of parameters of politics that existed prior to 2015, 2016. And I'm not entirely sure that we've caught up in the ways that we cover and talk about politics and evaluate the sort of performance of politics.
But, I'm very glad you said that, because it makes me think of actually the way that this sort of podcast, the rise of the podcast, and the sort of what we see at the debates connect, which is, at a debate, when you have someone on stage who just lies, people like to have this conversation about the role of the moderator and the format and the mic cutting and all this stuff. But, like the real issue is that someone went on stage and said decided that it was okay to just lie a lot. And the same thing happens, like on these hangout podcasts, like, you invite someone on and you're hanging out and they say, a bunch of batshit crazy stuff, sure, you can be like, Theo Vaughn, why don't you have, reams of research to call them out in real time? But actually the issue is that person just decided to like say a bunch of untrue things. That's the real problem. And so, I just kind of feel like we're losing, we get mired in these little kind of format or medium questions. The real issue is just sort of like the nature of our politics right now.
Totally. And I think it's also the nature of the media right now, because that same conversation we started out with my saying, well, this is not the this is not something totally new, but an evolution of the fragmentation of media. The part of that is the kind of choose your own truth adventure that exists in our media ecosystem right now. Like there is no, people want their content to be entertaining and confirmatory. It used to be that you want it to be authoritative and independent, right? And now, I think there's a desire to kind of subscribe to a particular set of views, whether that is Megyn Kelly's, whether that's Rachel Maddow's, whether it's, you have a kind of celebritification of the news person, the news personality.
But, I think another barrier though is like the paywall, like when I want to read the latest New York Times, Atlantic, Washington Post, whatever, if I'm not subscribing to that said publication, I might not get that article at all, or I might get like the top third of that article or something like that. But if you want to get garbage, if you want to get straight up lies, that's as free as it comes, and it's widely available. And so I can't tell you how many times I've been so frustrated, like, oh, I want to read this article, and oh God, I'm not subscribing. I've already got too many subscriptions, like, and so for someone else who is not going to pay that threshold. And oftentimes, I subscribe to the New York Times and the Washington Post, but like for a lot of people, that's not something they're willing to pay for. And I'm not saying that information is not worthy of like compensation. I mean, it's just a barrier that keeps people from getting access.
Yeah, Kellie, what you're saying is spot on, because there is something that has happened with the willingness to pay for information, the paywall, which now CNN is exploring more paywalls for its website, et cetera. So paywalls are a real monetization strategy in journalism. They have become that over time. There's also a secondary effect, which we talked about with my former boss from New York Times Opinion, James Bennett, on our podcast this week. We talked about how subscriptions also can indebt a journalistic publication to a certain type of reader who is, then they can threaten you with canceling subscriptions. So what does that mean for, does an audience lead journalism in a way that advertisers, which come with their own set of like thorny situations, but we have known over the course of time how to build those Chinese walls, how to keep, the division between the business side and the newsroom. There's just a different, like these like the desire to monetize media, the need to monetize media has created all kinds of incentives that make it harder for people to get, I think, great, independent journalism from big newsrooms and make it costly. Yeah.
You painted a good sort of evolution to how we got to this moment, and that it's sort of but this does feel like this year, this election feels like a break in some sense, even like the last few weeks, that Harris did her media blitz, and a lot of it was onto sort of this world of podcasts. I mean, I guess media companies are obviously clearly worried about how they're going to, ensure their future. But does this serve as a wake-up call? Like, are you seeing people in this moment looking around and be like, good God, like they're not coming to us anymore?
I think that, I do. I don't know. I'm not seeing that in the kind of upper echelons of the organizations, but I am seeing that within individual journalists. But I don't know. I mean, I think that the question about what is the health of your business is not just about the interview with these presidential candidates. I think that news organizations feel that they have a broad mandate to cover the world, the United States, these elections, or even on the fringes of these interviews, right? There's a lot of content that's being pumped out. I think they have a different question, which is how is this business going to survive, and how many of these businesses are going to survive? And the New York Times obviously has been the leader in that, and had a very, I think, smart strategy under the CEO Meredith Kopien, and before her Mark Thompson, who's now at CNN. But I think there's been a really strong strategy about building out the cultural offering, the games, the cooking, all these things that are the same things we're talking about are appealing in the podcast set.
Yep.
Yeah. And also, having relationships with serial. Now they're thinking, okay, well, the Daily might go behind a paywall 3 days,
just heard
post
that,
3 days. Yeah. And other kind of original shows kind of going, but having your back catalog, it's a kind of reverse windowing where your back catalog would be behind a paywall. I think that's the bigger question. They're trying to figure out how to monetize. Their bigger question is how to keep the business alive. Who's giving interviews to you is a question, but it's not the existential question for news organizations right now.
There's something about the games at the New York Times becoming the driver that is actually very comforting for me, because it reminds me of an earlier age when people would like get the newspaper because they wanted the comic strips and they wanted the box scores and they wanted like those kinds of things. And being beholden to Wordle seems better than being like audience captured or beholden to advertisers.
Totally.
And I realize that those things are still very much in play. But as we're trying to think, and we've been having this conversation for 20 years now, as we're trying to think like, how do you keep journalism alive when the economic base of journalism that existed for 100+ years
Right.
went away? We're in this period of reinvention, and there are going to be bad choices, there are going to be good choices, but it's fascinating to watch it change because there are so many consequences for how it changes. And when we're in the middle of a presidential election, we can see quite pointedly some of what is lost and some of what is gained.
Yeah. And podcasts are, I think, again, like a bit of a standout here, because one of the challenges has been not just the economics, but the attention. Like people do not have the attention to read, I mean, I love Evan Osnos, but that profile, the Joe Biden profile in the New Yorker that ran last year, it's like, I don't know how many people read all, was it 16,000 or 60,000 words? I mean, it was very long. And so people don't have the energy necessarily. People are reacting to headlines in this new world of kind of social media links, et cetera. And or taking positions based on people they're proximate to, their own surrogates in this. But podcast is a strange medium because people are tuning in and staying through, I'm sure you see in your own listenership, like 70, 80, 90% of these hour-long podcasts. In some cases, Joe Rogan, who I think will probably have Donald Trump on this cycle, having said that over the 2 years ago, saying he wouldn't have Donald Trump on. He didn't want to help him. He thought he was a danger to democracy. Now is kind of, it would be interesting. I'm curious about what it's like to be president.
Just asking questions.
Yeah, just asking questions.
Just asking questions. Kill me.
This is another conversation. But the fact that actually podcasting is now, you're right that it's in depth and people spend more time with it, but it is also starting to get clipped and taken out of context. And part of that sort of broken information ecosystem that we're seeing, especially through social media, it's really fascinating. I think that is largely enabled by the rise of video podcasting, which is just easier to just slice. And, so we're seeing that. I would love for you guys to talk about that on your podcast in depth at some point. But let me, to wrap up, we've been mostly focused on podcasting, which I think is right, because I think that's where a lot of the sort of in-depth conversation has been having. But I am curious about social media, especially because when Harris kind of first assumed the nomination, there was this weird like, wow, the internet kind of loves her. Social media does love her. And then there was this lull where people were like, oh, is she taking advantage of that? Is she pushing hard enough on social? And my reaction to that is generally like, if you're not seeing it, it means it's not for you, and it's like people complaining that they're not seeing enough on social is just because it's not for you. But I don't know. Do you have a sense of like how much the social strategies on each side, how effective they are compared to all the other more traditional strategies? I mean, what's been going on?
Yeah, I feel like it's so much. To some extent, it's the social strategies of the campaigns, but it's really the kind of surrogates, the endorsements, the communities around them, and the campaign's ability to pick up at speed and move on an issue, right? I think, the kind of broader Trump sphere was very quick to move on to questions of Biden's age and competence well before that debate that we all saw, right? And there were all these questions circulating in social media and right-wing social media saying, or right-leaning social media, the president's too old. There was misinformation about him, soiling his trousers on a trip to Europe. I said that so nicely compared to what I could have said. So, there was that
the Sleepy Joe.
And then you saw traditional media on the left saying, "Oh, this is complete misinformation," and then the debate happened. So there is questions about what's real or not. I think the Kamala HQ has been very good at picking up what the internet is putting down, what the culture is putting down, and that also exposed her on the right to questions of, is this campaign a hologram, a projection of what people want it to be? And that rightly led to the question of who is Kamala Harris, that I think she is now trying to answer in this media blitz. So I think the social campaigns of both campaigns are important, but they're somehow not as there's not as much agency and control, I believe, in this part. And although now you have to be in these spaces, I think it's something like 40% of voters under the age of 30 are getting their news from social media. That number is more like 20% for people overall, for Americans overall, on places like Instagram and TikTok. So you have to be in these places. You will end up on these places because user-generated content will put you there. And what you do on your own strategy is less compelling than whatever goes viral because some, 16-year-old wonderkin had the idea to put it to this music or this track or this way. But I think they're certainly paying attention. I just think it's more reactive. And so we can learn a lot more about their campaign strategies by looking at their proactive, what they're putting out, both in their advertisements and where they show up. And in that case, like Donald Trump showing up in New York and California this month, which he's going to be at MSG in New York, he's going to Coachella in California. Those are questions, like I have a big media question there. Like, what's the utility of showing up here when you've got to win in a handful of states that are quite tight? But I think it's just his ability to get a lot of media attention without having to sit down with CBS 60 Minutes, The cameras will be there.
Yeah.
Right. It's a novelty, and novelty drives news. So it's probably not a terrible strategy.
I gotta say, I'm like, I've tended to think that like each election can be defined a little bit by the medium or the media sort of the new media ecosystem that sort of drives it. And you could point to like the blog, the early online election, the blog election, the social media election. I feel like 2016 was largely podcasts had a big role. I'm like, there's part of me that's just kind of like stunned that we're not sitting here going, this is the TikTok election.
Of course
like,
it
just
is.
like,
no question.
It felt like, why hasn't it just clearly become the dominant thing? And you just, Nayeema, your description now that it's more reactive, it's more kind of nudging along the edges. Like, was it all an illusion how powerful social media was supposed to be? Like, what happened?
I think it is powerful, but I think that we have to see if these voters will vote. They're still low propensity voters, right? So the same category of voters I'm talking about that are on social media are not the ones that turn out in droves. Now, this will be the election where we kind of start to understand Gen Z voters for the first time in a real way. And so we'll see from there. I do think I'm not saying it's not going to be an election where voters are largely informed by social media. I'm just saying that the campaigns don't have as much control over what voters think on social media because of the nature of social media and how disaggregated it is. They can put money behind certain things, but social media has this real organic quality to it, right? Of what takes off and what doesn't.
And I wonder if that sort of fear of loss of control there is what then leads them to go into the sort of warm, comfortable embrace of Joe Rogan's podcast. It's like, oh, this is a space that we could kind of feel
it's
like
a safe
some
space.
Agency over. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I'm sure those play into each other. Any other final thoughts?
But, I want to say this is the podcast election more than the TikTok election. Am I wrong in saying
kind
that?
of was, but then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I do feel like in the last few weeks, it's like, oh gosh, maybe it is the podcast election. And as someone who is kind of
both.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen a lot of movement in both places. I don't think you can throw one out without the other. I mean, it's TikTok and it's podcast. And because I feel like podcasts or TikTok is more generational, younger Gen Zers, but podcasts kind of go
it's
a
for
much
us
bigger
olds.
range.
Right.
Yeah.
If you're a millennial, you're old now. This is like my learning from this election is that we are old now as millennials. It's certainly not the broadcast TV election because those the eyeballs are not necessarily there, and also the propensity to change minds is definitely not there, and that is what this election is going to rest on. It's so neck and neck. We'll see what happens.
So on election night, everyone will tune in to live television.
Of course.
And it's just
it'll have its moment.
Have those moments. I mean, it's just this fascinating thing that there's still kind of when something
watch John King.
Live, yeah.
All his glory. We watch Steve and his khakis.
Steve on his big board.
Nayeema, this has been so great. Thank you so much. And thanks for all your great work on Mixed Signals, which people can listen to every week from Semafor. But yeah, I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate you making the time.
Thank you for having me. Love your podcast. Big fan of what you guys do and learn a lot from you. So thank you guys.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And thanks to everyone who was watching on YouTube and listening on the podcast. And we will be back with quote unquote regular episodes on Tuesday. But have a good weekend, everyone. And we will see you soon. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.